In the 1950s, when Nikita Khrushchev, whom you see here, was in power, the Soviet leaders publicly did sign on to MAD, to Mutual Assured Destruction, as a doctrine. And Soviet officials were present and participated in the meetings where MAD was developed. And I wanted to recommend that people who would like a very concise and excellent review of this question of the hideous two-empire design based on mutual assured destruction and Malthusianism to borrow from someone the tape of LaRouche's March 1984 half-hour broadcast, Kissinger, Soviet Agent of Influence, if you haven't seen it for 9 years or didn't see it at the time. So, Khrushchev himself corresponded with Bertrand Russell, a key architect of MAD, on the unthinkability of war in the nuclear age. But, as Jonathan has mentioned, this did not change the strategy of the Soviet High Command. In fact, since we didn't have defense under MAD but only deterrence, the Soviets found some useful nuances in Russian, and when they were translating about their own missiles, they used the word "sdерживание," which means restraint, and when talking about the U.S. missiles, they would say "ustrashение," which means terrorization. In 1962, Marshal Sokolovsky published his book, Military Strategy, and expressed Soviet thinking. I won't give the full quotation, but it included reference to an anti-missile defense system, application of active measures to deflect the missile from its target. He said special attention is devoted to lasers. It is considered in the future any missile and satellite can be destroyed with powerful lasers. But it was only in the late 1960s, after Kennedy was gone, Charles de Gaulle, you see here, was on the way out, only then did Moscow move to enshrine MAD in treaty arrangements with the United States, and their negotiating partner was Mr. Robert Strange McNamara, Secretary of Defense under President Johnson. At the close of 1967, he launched negotiations for a treaty to ban anti-ballistic missile systems, the ABM treaty. Even as late as January '68, after McNamara's first overtures for an ABM treaty, Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin would say at a press conference in London that any superpower capable of developing technical means of destroying nuclear missiles that did not do so, did not develop such strategic defense, was clearly advocating offensive nuclear war. 2 months later, March 1968, Moscow signaled a shift in its public posture. And this was announced by means of a long article in Pravda, which made the classic MAD argument that general war would be unthinkable in the nuclear age. The author of the Pravda article was a former advisor to Khrushchev and to Yuri Andropov at the Communist Party Central Committee before Andropov took over the KGB. His name was Fyodor Burlatsky, there on the left with Andropov from 1961. After Johnson and McNamara left office in '68, the negotiations for the ABM treaty were completed by Kissinger. It was signed by Nixon and Brezhnev. It limited each side, this was 1972, to one anti-ballistic missile system. And it reflected some underlying thinking that the United States maintained defenses for missile fields in North Dakota, while the Soviets installed the Galosh ABM system around the capital, Moscow. In the 1970s, as shown by this 1976 campaign pamphlet, The Danger of General War, LaRouche was warning that the adoption of MAD increased the danger of war. And I want to stress that Moscow was well aware of what LaRouche was saying and publishing already in those years, judging by how often Soviet so-called journalists would pop up at Executive Intelligence Review headquarters to collect pamphlets like this one. The KGB was watching LaRouche very closely. And I can say that the first full-year subscription to EIR ever sold by me was to a Soviet diplomat, although he laundered the payment, and EIR received the check for $396 from a Swiss grain company. Fusion Energy Foundation publications, meanwhile, were writing a lot about Soviet laser work, and therefore Moscow knew that we knew the military applications of their work in this area. In fact, FEF representatives did attend conferences in Russia in the 1970s. But really, anybody who chose to look at the evidence could see that as soon as the ink had dried on the ABM treaty, Soviet anti-ballistic missile programs were simply taken behind closed doors. This diagram leaked out. I don't know if you can see, it has a lovely caption, "Light beam to burn hole in missile." And it got by the censors. It's from a Russian pamphlet published in the Soviet Union in 1974. We rewrote the captions, the originals in Russian, 2 years after the ABM treaty was signed. So the Soviets also knew from their EIR subscriptions as well as other means that LaRouche had Reagan's good ear. And as you've been told, half a dozen Soviet representatives, including Mr. Shershnev of the back channel, were present at the February 1982 EIR seminar in Washington. This is the original wide-column article in New Solidarity reporting it, where Lynn proposed the joint development of BMD, ballistic missile defense, by the U.S. and the USSR. I saw them furiously taking notes because I was there. I was the warm-up act, if you can call it that, talking about Siberia. So when Reagan spoke on March 23, 1983, the Soviets knew that it was LaRouche's policy the president had enunciated against all the assurances of their friends in the Democratic Party and Kissinger circles. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Andropov, Yuri Andropov by this time, was quick to respond, and he was furious. On March 27, 1983, Pravda printed a front-page interview with Andropov. Question: President Reagan declared he has devised a new defensive conception. What is this in practice? Andropov, quote, "This requires special mention. Laymen may even find it attractive as the president speaks about what seem to be defensive measures, but the strategic offensive forces of the United States will continue to be developed and upgraded to acquire a nuclear first strike capability. Under these conditions, the intent to secure ABM defense is a bid to disarm the Soviet Union in the face of the U.S. nuclear threat," close quote. But it's instructive also to hear how Andropov's response was characterized by a third party. This book shown here is by a Soviet emigre named Ilya Zimtsov, who heads a think tank in Israel, and he wrote, quote, in this whole biography of Andropov, "Only once did Andropov's nerves fail him. It happened when the American president announced a new nuclear strategy based on the development of laser weaponry. Andropov answered Reagan calmly, as always, but notes of panic could be detected. He called the American president's actions and policies deceitful, irresponsible, crazy, and mad. It was on this occasion that the world could see the true Andropov," close quote. Now the next is meant to show the logo of Der Spiegel, but you'll enjoy the cover also. Yeah, there. On April 24th, 1983, Andropov came out with an interview in West Germany's Der Spiegel magazine, whose editorial attitude on SDI is shown by this cover from 1984. It says, "Reagan after the elections, weapons for Star Wars." 83, April 24th, Andropov rejected SDI as fraught with adventurism and danger. He said it would bring the world closer to the nuclear precipice, and he accused Reagan of planting a mine under the entire process of strategic arms limitation. Instead of SDI, Andropov in this interview suggested in very bald geopolitical language that the United States and the Soviet Union should divide the world into spheres of influence. In a press release, July 7th, 1983, LaRouche issued what he called an open challenge to the morality of Andropov, and noted that while Andropov had attacked Reagan's speech, he had kept its contents from the Soviet population. The Soviet press, in fact, never did publish the text of the March 23rd offer. And in that July memo, LaRouche concluded, "Act to stop this nonsense now. Let the world know you are sensible enough to accept the generous offer President Reagan extended March 23rd. Prove that you are truly a man of peace." This, by the way, was the period Andropov was writing letters to Samantha Smith, age 12, and you remember. So there was no such proof forthcoming from Andropov. Instead, on August 10th, 1983, a full-page article by Mr. Burlatsky appeared in the weekly Literaturная Gazeta. And in violent terms, he said, quote, "If the Americans could be the first to create a somewhat effective space system, then this would create a practically irresistible temptation for the American military men and politicians to inflict a first strike and forever get rid of the adversary. On the other hand, the Soviet Union and its allies would be faced with a totally new military and political dilemma. In other words, space weapons are provocative weapons. They are absolutely a casus belli for nuclear war." And casus belli means, in fact, an event that is the occasion for war. It's the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, or the assassination of the Archduke at Sarajevo, the beginning of World War I. On October 26, 1983, Burlatsky followed up with the article also in Literaturная Gazeta, shown here. The headline is "Star Wars," and this time he attacked LaRouche by name. He quoted a leaflet that the European Labour Party, Helga's party at that time, had issued called "Beam Weapons, Soviets Threaten Nuclear Strike," and he had the quote from our leaflet following, Instead of accepting Reagan's proposal for joint development of beam weapons, which the Soviet Union is secretly developing anyway, Burlatsky threatens a Russian preventive strike, close quote. Having quoted that, Burlatsky said, quote again from him, "Reading these lines, I did not know if I should be indignant or laugh about the amusing and ridiculous maxims of the authors, the conjugal symbiosis of the American LaRouche and his wife, the German Helga Zepp-LaRouche," close quote. It was apparent at this time that that Soviet strategists would try to use the SDI as a wedge to break the NATO alliance, pushing a propaganda line that Washington wanted to hide behind an anti-missile defense screen, leaving Western Europe to its own devices. This was in a period when Kissinger and others were talking about decoupling Europe from North America. Let's just see if what I'm looking for is the next slide. Yeah. In pamphlets like this one, LaRouche motivated the importance of SDI for Europe's security. And then in the fall of '83 and in early '84, LaRouche spoke to military men, politicians, and economists at EIR seminars in several European countries, motivating that SDI was in the interest of European defense as well, and general benefit. Remember, of course, it was in 1984 that Helga founded the Schiller Institute as an emergency initiative to save the Western alliance through a true renaissance of culture and statecraft. At the bottom of this slide is a clipping from Izvestia, the newspaper of the Soviet state, November 15, 1983, about the EIR seminar LaRouche had addressed in Rome, Italy. The headline says, "Sabbath at the Hotel Majestic," and the text is a classic piece of poison prose. Outwardly, they in no way looked like cavemen. They were well-dressed, clean-shaven, and their manners were courteous and polite. But all it took was to turn up in that hall and listen to the speeches, and no doubt remained. You were among the troglodytes. They came to Rome from various countries on invitation from a certain Lyndon LaRouche. As the hobby horse of his electoral campaign, LaRouche has chosen space weaponry. He was delighted with the proposals Reagan made on March 23rd of this year to fill near-Earth space with lasers and other types of total weaponry, close quote. Then, noting the presence at the seminar of prominent military men from the United States and Europe, Izvestia concluded, "The get-together at the Hotel Majestic showed that both Reagan and LaRouche have followers in the old world," close quote. On April 2nd, 1984, the Communist Party Daily's senior commentator, Yuri Zhukov, wrote about a similar seminar on SDI that EIR held in Paris, where LaRouche spoke. And this is the article at the top. It's called "A Colloquium of Murderers." March 24th, same conference was covered by Literaturная Gazeta's Alexander Sabov, who branded LaRouche a neo-fascist. And later in April, Sabov, the Literaturная correspondent, confronted LaRouche representatives in Paris, demanding to know LaRouche's electoral chances and whether or not he intended to continue his presidential campaign announced in September of '83. Well, of course, LaRouche did campaign, and he did so by putting on national TV broadcasts like this one, January 21, 1984, calling for a national defense emergency mobilization. And these from March, two on Kissinger, including the one I mentioned before, with the history of MAD versus the new doctrine. And then the Soviet attacks on LaRouche became very explicit. And here you see the previously mentioned Izvestia article of March 12, 1984, a TASS dispatch entitled "One More Scandal." I'll quote it. "The scandalous ties of the Reagan administration with LaRouche were exposed in a special report on NBC television. The White House did not even try to deny it. From time to time, mumbled White House official Representative L. speaks, we meet with different people who have information which might be useful to us. A former NSC representative, N. Bailey, spoke about some of these details in an interview with the Chicago Tribune, having said that he sometimes met with LaRouche representatives and that he continues to have ties to the caucus, ICLC. Bailey openly said that the help of the LaRoucheites is highly useful since, quote, they have a fine intelligence network." And Izvestia finished, "The acknowledgement by the White House not only exposes the true face of LaRouche, but it also shows that the current Washington administration does not shy away from the services of neo-fascist provocateurs," close quote. So that was the demand, public demand, besides the behind-the-scene ones, to cut the ties with Lynn. Soviet maneuvers to expunge the influence of LaRouche on U.S. and NATO strategy escalated under the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power April '85. Remember, it was in December 1984, during Gorbachev's test run to London, that the erstwhile Iron Lady, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, turned into a marshmallow with her comment, "I like Mr. Gorbachev, I think we can do business together." Thatcher's conversion to Gorby mania was key to the process of knocking Reagan off the SDI track and into a series of arms control deals in the framework of MAD, like the Intermediate Nuclear Force, the INF Treaty of 1987. But in the summer of '85, we at EIR published the special report, Global Showdown, the Russian Imperial War Plan for 1988. It was outline written by LaRouche, commissioned by LaRouche, and with a preface by him, and it swept the intelligence community and military leadership circles in NATO countries. And I can't resist saying that the reason it could do that is that subscribers to EIR contributed sufficient funds to purchase gift copies for such free distribution. This was the first internationally circulated expose of Gorbachev as the man handpicked by Andropov and approved by the Soviet military to mobilize the Soviet Union and its empire to achieve strategic superiority, to attempt to. Global Showdown traced the original scheme for the perestroika reform of the economy to Soviet general staff, military strategists specializing in the war economy. The report identified the war mobilization overall as the Ogarkov plan, after the ex-chief of staff, Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov. You may remember him as the man with the pointer after the KAL downing, saying, "Yeah, we did it and we'll do it again." The report explained that the driving ideology of the Soviet leadership was the ancient myth that Moscow would be the third Rome, capital of a final world empire. Authors of the report took it on the road, presenting the findings at press conferences throughout Europe and America. In Turkey, the Soviet embassy held a press conference for the sole purpose of denouncing a chapter of the report concerning NATO's southern flank. 1986 brought Soviet attacks of ever greater nastiness against LaRouche. These characters can only think up one title in the whole world, as you noticed from Dennis King's book. This is the lead page of a 5-page packet in the New Times Weekly, September 5th, 1986, published in a dozen languages. But first, there was the Palme Gambit. Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was shot to death on a Stockholm street on February 28, 1986, and an international Soviet disinformation campaign began immediately to blame LaRouche for the murder. On March the 1st, Soviets of that year, 86, Soviet Central Committee member Georgy Arbatov told Swedish correspondents in Moscow, I do not know who killed Palme, but I know all too well who hated him. I saw demonstrations against him by fascist hooligans, close quote. The next day, Pravda and Izvestia asserted that right-wing Western circles were behind the hit, and then leftist press in Sweden began to report that the European Labour Party in Sweden, linked with LaRouche, was under investigation in the Palme murder. This campaign crescendoed with the arrest on March 12, 1986, of suspect Victor Gunnarsson, later released, whom the press and police falsely portrayed as a member of the ELP. And once this information was spread all over the world, including by Erwin Sewell of the Anti-Defamation League and by NBC television, the Soviets began to play it back. Radio Moscow, Izvestia, the military daily Red Star, all attributed the assassination to the right-wing extremist European Labour Party, or European Workers' Party, as they insist on putting it. On March 21st, 1986, the Soviet TV nightly news program Vremya said about the ELP, quote, "The party headquarters is in the United States. It is headed by a U.S. millionaire, LaRouche," close quote. The smear campaign to tie LaRouche to the Palme murder eventually led to a TV docudrama broadcast in Sweden and the Soviet Union in early 1987 called Why Did They Kill Olof Palme? Here the assassination was explicitly identified with LaRouche, and over footage of an ELP demo, 1974, you'll see it in a moment, against Palme's policies, the program quoted Stockholm Police Chief Hans Holmér. Give me a chance to rest while you watch the show. You can turn up the volume now, a little.
На перекрестке улиц Свевеген и Туннельгаттен убийца выстрелил в спину Пальме, потом еще раз.
Saying the killer shot Palme twice in the back.
Настоящий.
Real blood, the blood of Olof Palme. Olof Palme.
Кровь Олафа Пальме. Этот вопрос, начертанный большими буквами,
The question why is written in big letters on the wall and in little tags attached to the roses.
прилипнет он к букету.
Now please do turn up the volume if you can. This says why.
Почему?
Why did they kill Olof Palme? This is Holmer. One of the links in the chain of hypotheses is the neo-fascists. Some tracks lead to the European Labour Party, Swedish police chief.
Одно из звеньев в цепи гипотез неофашисты. Некоторые следы ведут к
That's
европейскому.
ELP demonstration footage being used.
Эти бравые ребята еще.
And then a Soviet actor portraying a neo-fascist thug spoke. These gallant lads already in 1974 declared, "We will shoot Olof Palme." The European Labour Party is already a force in more than 10 countries. Its headquarters is in the US. Its goal is struggle against communism. Fighting with the Reds, they don't forget about the Pinks.
Послушайте, что говорит их лидер Ларуш.
I don't know if you caught it, but listen to what their leader, LaRouche, says. Palme is a madman. All his words and actions, his speeches in favor of democracy are hypocrisy. Behind that mask is a real devil.
Сущий дьявол.
That's it for the video. In 1992, a former officer of the East German Secret Service, Stasi, Dr. Herbert Bremer, publicly told how he was assigned to initiate the disinformation campaign to blame LaRouche and the ELP for the Palme assassination. In the meantime, the Palme smear fizzled with the release of Gunnarsson, and LaRouche's international clout grew in the wake of the March '86 victories by LaRouche-linked candidates in Illinois. That summer, a weekly newspaper linked to the newly formed Soviet Culture Fund, a project of Raisa Gorbachova, Armand Hammer, and others, shifted to a new type of coverage. On August 7th, 1986, Sovietskaya Kultura suggested that, Soviet culture, misnomer, but that's what it was called, that LaRouche could become president by credit card. This I have to quote, Lyndon LaRouche, a typical American nouveau riche businessman, the owner of a large network of financial and credit organizations, is being sued by First Fidelity Bank for $750,000, which LaRouche appropriated for himself in one stroke, using the resources of his financial empire. This money has been transferred to his account by credit card manipulation. All this would not be worth mentioning were it not for one interesting detail. In recent years, Lyndon LaRouche has wanted to assume the role of a political leader. He even was a candidate for president of the United States. And if one U.S. president could get involved in Watergate, why can't LaRouche manipulate credit cards in the fight? Wouldn't he try his luck and combine what is profitable, tricks with credit cards, with the fight for the presidential seat and become a big shot? Close quote. Now, this might sound funny, but the Soviet demand was not. It was in deadly earnest. And they followed up, Sovietskaya Kultura, again, September 30th, 1986, reporting on how the LaRouche ticket's Illinois victories had astonished politicians. The correspondent Sisnev proposed that LaRouche be removed from the political arena. Quote, "For a long time, LaRouche was in the shadows, and then in the beginning of the 1970s, he appeared on the U.S. political scene as a politician, proclaiming himself a friend of American working people, poor, hungry, homeless. The notorious International Caucus of Labor Committees emerged with headquarters in Wiesbaden, subdivisions in several countries of Europe, Asia, and Latin America. How is it possible that the LaRoucheites can act so openly and fearlessly? In this respect, the Washington Post wrote," this is Sovietskaya Kultura quoting the Washington Post, quote, "Why doesn't anybody ask why the Internal Revenue Service is not interested in the affairs of a man who receives millions of dollars from publications and his contributions but has not paid any taxes?" End of the Washington Post internal quote. The article goes on, "LaRouche and his followers are zealous supporters of the notorious Star Wars program. LaRouche has declared his candidacy for the 1988 presidential elections. In a word, LaRouche is now clearly going through a definite period of growth." Close quote. So that was September 30th, and 6 days later came the Leesburg raid, and then the Reykjavik summit. Literaturная Gazeta, February 3rd, 1988, at the time of LaRouche's federal conspiracy trial in Boston, the one that flopped. This article, again by Sabov, is called "Yankees and Teutons, the United Neo-Fascist Party of Europe and the USA Can't Wait to Get Power." Lynn is depicted as Rambo and Helga as a German war goddess, Teutonia. In this article, Saboff reported that LaRouche already commanded around 10% of the vote in the United States. Saboff said that NBC had called LaRouche a small-time Hitler, but added, quote, "Is it really so small time if literally from the beak of this nuclear lobby knocked together by the ELP of the old world and the ultra-right Democrats of the USA, the American administration now in power snatched the idea of the SDI?" It's a little twisted prose, but they're saying it's a big deal because LaRouche gave Reagan the SDI. I want lastly to highlight an extraordinary dialogue that appeared in International Affairs, also in the Russian and French editions, monthly journal of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs during 1987, which proves that during the most lurid Soviet propaganda against LaRouche and the vehement behind-the-scenes demands for his elimination, the idea remained alive within Soviet ruling institutions that they might have to deal with LaRouche on the basis of reality. That is, on the basis of the real content of LaRouche's policies, which was war avoidance, but with no appeasement or toleration of a Soviet-Russian empire. This is obviously of extreme importance for the crisis of today in the face of a resurgence by the forces, pro-empire forces within the Russian military and elements of the old nomenklatura, the ruling elite of the Soviet era. In the March 1987 issue, International Affairs slandered LaRouche in an article by Soviet lawyer activist Vladimir Pustogarov entitled "Neo-Fascism, Weapon of Reaction," alluding to the alleged neo-fascist LaRouche's previous influence on Reagan and his growing influence in general. Pustogarov wildly projected, "Today there has emerged a new danger, namely the danger of neo-fascists gaining access to nuclear weapons." LaRouche sent a long letter to the editor of International Affairs in reply, and 6 months later, lo and behold, the October issue published LaRouche's letter in full. And the letter said, quote, "In light of the importance of the AIDS pandemic and the eruption of the worst financial crisis in history, there is a 70 to 80% likelihood that I shall be a major influence in shaping U.S. domestic and foreign policies. Academician Pustogarov and others may believe that publishing even the wildest fantasies against me is politically sound, since I am classed as a prominent political adversary of the Soviet Union. The academician overlooks the small point on which Marshal Ogarkov might instruct him, that it is the U.S. and the USSR which are adversaries. And since I am an influential voice among those U.S. figures working consistently for a constructive form of durable war avoidance between our nations, your journal should think it most counterproductive to frighten Soviet children with the imported obscene fantasies featured in the identified article," close quote. That all appeared in the Russian publication, Soviet publication. In a short introduction, the editor said, quote, "Had it only been a question of Mr. LaRouche's squabble with the journal, his letter would not really have been worthy of note. But he touches on some fundamental realities of today, and therefore we print the full text of his letter and our answer to it. The Soviets knew Lin's war avoidance principles from the back-channel contacts during the formulation of SDI, and they knew it from his own writings. This book-length memorandum came out in 1980, Why Revival of SALT Won't Stop War. It rigorously distinguished true war avoidance from arms negotiations carried out under the hegemony of MAD. In the late 1970s and 1980s, there were other pamphlets like this, Stop the U.S.-Soviet Nuclear Countdown, and even an open dialogue with Leonid Brezhnev. Various Soviet representatives were exposed to LaRouche's profound insights into the difficulties of statecraft specific to Russia's history and culture. They knew that what he had forecast in Global Showdown, namely that an attempt by the Soviets to outstrip the SDI with a brute force war economy mobilization without a transformation of culture and economic practice that could not be done under a police state, that would quickly bring the Soviet economy to a breaking point, followed by political upheavals. And therefore, Lin could say in his famous October 12, 1988 Kempinski speech, which you saw excerpted before, quote, "Moscow regards me with a curious sort of fascination, and since President Reagan first announced SDI, considers everything I say on policy matters to be influential and very credible." Soviet leaders were not the only ones aware of LaRouche's statesmanship. The Soviet slander campaign backfired in a beautiful way, and I think our distinguished guest from Ukraine will allow me to quote a young compatriot of theirs, the political activist Taras Chornovil, who was interviewed in EIR in 1991. Asked if he knew of LaRouche, he replied, quote, "Yes, I have indeed heard of the name, thanks to the press of the Soviet Union. And to the degree that the Soviet press covered major developments of the West, such as SDI, then the name of LaRouche was portrayed in a negative light. We, however, have learned to read between the lines, and we understood that if the name of a political dissident were caricatured in such a very negative way, then that person must have serious political views. If I remember correctly, LaRouche's SDI played a very significant role in the early years of the Reagan government in pressuring the Soviet Union and providing the opportunity for the countries of Eastern Europe to escape from the military boot and become democratic nations. I do not think that the start of the democratic process in the Soviet Union was the result of Gorbachev's initiatives. He was forced to come to terms with the West. And I think that if people in the West view LaRouche literally as a political dissident, then that is very sad, because he played an important role in international politics at the time for us Ukrainians. Perhaps the West cannot fully appreciate the impact that the doctrine had on us. So it was a long-term effect of LaRouche's SDI policy that many people in the East were prepared to be receptive to LaRouche's ideas when it became possible to circulate them there after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you've already seen this, but just 3 years and 10 months after Yankees and Teutons, you could read in the Moscow paper Svobodnaya Slova, Free Word, put out by Democratic Union, an article like this: LaRouche, the American dissident. On June 12, 1992, Russians picketed the American embassy in Moscow. You'll see a man in the center holding a placard, saying, "Freedom for the American political prisoner, Lyndon LaRouche and his colleagues." So that's the demonstration. And on the left is Mrs. Novodvorskaya, the founder of Democratic Union, a person jailed many times under Soviet power. Ironically, LaRouche today can directly address a far greater number of Russians while he sits in prison than he could 10 years ago. And I guess Anno's stolen my thunder on the book, but this book will keep thundering for a long time. Such is the power of ideas. So you see the English on the left. The Russian edition was brought out at the very end of last year by the Schiller Institute and the Ukrainian University in Moscow. It's translated by Viktor Petrenko, and Professor Muranivsky, rector of the Ukrainian University in Moscow, was scientific editor for the Russian edition. And the shuttle didn't reverse direction. It's just that the printing company in Russia did it right, and we flipped the picture. Anyway, so this book is now something to celebrate for sure. And the fact that 10,000 copies of it are circulating. But besides celebrating the appearance of the book, I would say that the world in its present state needs Lynn not just via the printed page and by telephone, but in a position to provide guidance hands-on, starting here in the United States.
At a three-day seminar in our nation's capital in February 1982, internationally renowned economist Lyndon H. LaRouche, Jr. first announced to an audience of U.S. and foreign officials a new strategic doctrine, which would be made famous 13 months later by President Ronald Reagan. LaRouche proposed to scrap the strategic doctrine which had then ruled the United States for more than 20 years, the doctrine known as mutual and assured destruction. LaRouche proposed a new strategic doctrine of strategic missile defense, based on high-powered lasers, particle beam weapons, and related technologies already in the engineering phase or awaiting development in our scientific laboratories. Perhaps only Ronald Reagan knows who finally convinced him to announce the new strategic doctrine on March 23rd, 1983. One thing is certain: it was the combined forces of the Soviet dictatorship, the liberal establishment, and Henry A. Kissinger, who worked from immediately following the president's broadcast to attempt to discredit the president's doctrine of mutually assured survival. Today, Democratic presidential candidate LaRouche will tell you some of the reasons why Soviet agents of influence like Henry A. Kissinger are working to cut the only future defense against a Russian empire's sneak missile attack out of the federal budget.
In another nationwide broadcast earlier this year, and in several books and articles which have been published on the subject, I've explained why a crash program to develop a strategic ballistic anti-missile defense system before 1988 is necessary to the physical survival of our nation. Tonight, I shall report to you on a different aspect of the same matter: why Soviet agents of influence like Henry A. Kissinger are working to sabotage President Reagan's commitments to providing the world the only possible alternative to a thermonuclear war threatened for the period immediately ahead of us. For nearly 40 years, from 1946 until March 23rd, 1983, the strategic and foreign policies of the United States were steered by the influence of the most evil man of the 20th century, the late Bertrand Russell. This may seem unbelievable to those many of you who think of Russell as a leading pacifist, but I am not exaggerating in the slightest degree. The documents are many, and the evidence is overwhelmingly beyond dispute. We shall look briefly at Russell's policies, and then we shall learn how influential figures such as McGeorge Bundy and Henry Kissinger have dedicated their lives to implementing Russell's not really very secret agreements with the Soviet dictators for nearly 30 years. The shaping of U.S. strategic doctrines and foreign policies covers two parts of the post-war period. The first phase covers the period from about October 1946 until the end of the 1950s. Throughout that entire period, both the strategic doctrine and the foreign policy of the United States and its allies were based on a policy which Russell published in the October 1946 issue of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In that article, Russell made 2 points. First, Russell insisted that the nations, including the United States, must give up their national sovereignties. He demanded that a world government agency with a monopoly of possession and use of nuclear arsenals be established. Second, Russell proposed that if the Soviet Union refused to submit to the agreements to establish such a world government agency, that the United States and Britain must conduct preventive nuclear war against Russia. This war should begin as soon as the Anglo-Americans had sufficient arsenals of nuclear weapons to destroy the Soviet non-nuclear forces, and should occur before the Russians began to develop nuclear arsenals of their own. This preventive nuclear war policy of Russell's was adopted by the United States and Britain and remained in effect until the middle to late 1950s. Russell began developing a second version of his strategic doctrine shortly after the death of Joseph Stalin. At the point, the Russians were already building up an arsenal of fission weapons and had constructed a prototype of an H-bomb. Russell communicated messages to the new leaders in Moscow, offering to cooperate with Moscow in setting up a worldwide empire, of which the eastern part would be ruled by the Russian Empire, and the western part some sort of world federalist dictatorship ruled over by the wealthy financial families of such places as New York, Boston, London, and Switzerland. In London, at a 1955 conference of Russell's World Association of Parliamentarians for World Government, 4 Soviet officials attended to signal Moscow's acceptance of Russell's new strategic agenda. By about 1957, Henry Kissinger's masters at the New York Council on Foreign Relations had accepted the Russell-Khrushchev package. In 1957, the book Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy was published in Kissinger's name. The conclusive event occurred a year later, in 1958, at the second Pugwash Conference held in Quebec. At that conference, the details of the agreement between Russell and Khrushchev were presented in a keynote address by Russell's accomplice, Dr. Leo Szilard. George Bundy, Robert McNamara, Maxwell Taylor, and Bundy's nasty-tempered National Security Council consultant, Henry Kissinger, among others, slipped Russell's agreements with Khrushchev into the Kennedy administration's policy. From that time until March 23rd, 1983, the strategic policies which Russell had negotiated with Khrushchev were the strategic doctrines of the United States and NATO. Since the late 1950s, for more than 25 years, Henry Kissinger has been one of the leading Soviet moles working inside the policy-making processes of our government, working to help Moscow in keeping the United States in submission to those Pugwash agreements announced by Szilard in 1958. Szilard's keynote address at the second Pugwash Conference was the basis for the famous film, Dr. Strangelove, in which the character Dr. Strangelove is modeled on Szilard himself. To most of you, Dr. Szilard's proposals will sound like outright treason. The central feature of Russells and Szilard's agreement with Nikita Khrushchev was the agreement to divide the entire world between two world empires. The first to be ruled by the wealthy and powerful financial families of the so-called liberal establishments of Britain and the United States. The second part of the world empire, the Russian Empire, would be made much larger than the Russians' division of the world negotiated during the wartime Yalta Conference. This is the so-called New Yalta Agreement with Moscow, to which Henry Kissinger and his business partner, Britain's Lord Carrington, are dedicated today. As Kissinger's article in the March 5th issue of Time magazine indicates, Kissinger is presently committed to giving the Soviet Russian Empire not only the Middle East, but also the effective Finlandization of all of Scandinavia and Germany under Soviet regional domination. This is part of a deal for which Henry Kissinger and his friends have been working for approximately 25 years. In order to establish long-term balance between the two proposed empires, Szilard in 1958 demanded that both superpowers develop thermonuclear arsenals large enough that each could guarantee the nuclear destruction of the other in case of a general war between the two. This is the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, sometimes called mutual and assured destruction, or simply MAD. However, Szilard was no pacifist. He recommended that local wars, including limited nuclear wars, were indispensable for letting off steam. He proposed a set of guidelines be adopted to permit the powers to conduct limited colonial and other nuclear wars, but with secret understandings adopted to prevent local wars or limited nuclear wars from spilling over to become general thermonuclear wars. This doctrine, set forth by Szilard back in 1958, became known as flexible response. These doctrines, agreed upon between Bertrand Russells' crew and the Khrushchev government in Moscow, were smuggled into the Kennedy administration by McGeorge Bundy and Bundy's consultant, Henry A. Kissinger, as well as Robert McNamara and Max Taylor. These policies gave us the Bay of Pigs crisis, the Berlin Wall crisis, the Cuba Missiles crisis, and the long war in Vietnam. All of this was orchestrated behind the backs of our elected officials of government, excepting, of course, a few witting scoundrels. President Kennedy talked to persons such as Douglas MacArthur, an opponent of such doctrines. Suddenly, President Kennedy was assassinated. After President Kennedy ordered McGeorge Bundy to fire Henry Kissinger, Kissinger pursued his career as a participant in meetings of the Pugwash Conference back channel to Moscow, up to the point that Kissinger was inserted as a mole into the Nixon White House. In every known case, including the SALT I Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and the SALT II negotiations, Kissinger's role under Presidents Nixon and Ford was that of a Soviet agent of influence, working against the vital strategic interests of the United States and in support of secret agreements with Moscow, reached through such back channels as the Pugwash Conference, David Rockefeller's Dartmouth Conference, and the Aspen Institute. Kissinger and his liberal establishment masters and accomplices have worked consistently for approximately 25 years to aid the Soviet Empire's achievement of the New Yalta agreements worked out between Khrushchev and the circles of the evil Bertrand Russell. This is the reason that the world is near the brink of thermonuclear war today. Through the work of such people as McGeorge Bundy, Robert S. McNamara, Averell Harriman, and Henry Kissinger, the Soviet Empire has been enabled to develop the strategic capabilities to challenge directly the most vital interests of the United States. But for the sabotage of the interests and national defense of the United States by aid of such influential circles and persons, there would be no danger of an actual thermonuclear war today. To understand fully the policies of Kissinger and his kind, we must look at a second feature of the policies of such evil men as Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, and the cult leader, Aleister Crowley. Three men who did more to destroy the United States from within, with the help of the late Robert M. Hutchins, than perhaps anyone else. To understand the motives behind Russell's New Yalta proposal to Khrushchev, one must know the bare facts about Russell's long-term utopian policies. I read you two brief excerpts now from the writings of Bertrand Russell. The first of these is a passage from a book Russell wrote back in 1923, entitled The Prospects of Industrial Civilization. See if you recognize this policy as being that of an ecologist political faction in the United States and Europe today.
The white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without the help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the benefits aimed at by socialism can only be partially realized, and the less prolific races will have to defend themselves by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary.
After the war, in 1951, the same satanic Russell wrote in a book named The Impact of Science on Society.
At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War, so far, has had no great effect on this increase, which continued through each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could spread through the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of it?
The essence of Bertrand Russell's purpose for the entire extent of his satanic adult life was the destruction of modern civilization and the creation of a miserable condition of feudalistic society to be ruled by the Anglo-Saxon race. Russell intended this to be a form of utopia, which was to be established by massive genocide against the darker-skinned populations of the world, including such sections of humanity as those of Arab, Turkish, Greek, Italian, and Spanish ethnic origins. Russell's proposal for a scheme of world government and his back-channel New Yalta agreements with Moscow were for Russell, for H.G. Wells, and for their co-thinkers of the liberal establishments a way of bringing Russell's design for a feudalist Anglo-Saxon world empire into being. Russell found among the hardened racialists within the ruling caste of the Russian Soviet dictatorship a partner who had similar, if conflicting, goals to match Russell's own. Russell and such avowed feudalists as Henry Kissinger allied with the Soviet dictatorship not because they like Russia, but because they hate what the United States represents. The most crucial point is this: to be able to sell the doctrine of post-industrial society to the fellows in our Pentagon and Congress, Russell and his crowd had to convince those military and political leaders that a technologically progressive development of the agro-industrial base of the national economy was no longer strategically essential. This selling job was done by insisting that warfighting would come to a halt at the time the thermonuclear intercontinental barrages were completed. Therefore, the argument went, there is no need for the military forces of the depth which might be used to continue warfighting after that stage of the war, after the initial thermonuclear bombardment. In other words, under conditions of general thermonuclear war between the superpowers, there would not be enough left alive, they argued, after the opening salvos to continue war. Therefore, the argument went, conventional military capabilities have no strategic significance for fighting a general war. Therefore, the spokesman for turning the United States into a post-industrial junk heap argued, technologically progressive investment in agriculture and in industry is no longer important for national defense. Something more cruel, more criminal was added. neo-Malthusian programs of genocide against the populations of the so-called developing nations. It happens the cheapest and easiest way to commit genocide is by famine and epidemic under slave labor conditions, as the Nazis showed at Auschwitz. Therefore, until the 1960s, even those among our military, for example, who might share the Anglo-Saxon racism of an Averell Harriman, would have defended the well-being of Latin American nations on elementary grounds of U.S. strategic logistical interests. With the introduction of flexible response, this changed. Like the Nazi regime during World War II, the world's most powerful international and financial agencies today have targeted between 120 and 150 millions black Africans for death through genocide, death by famine and epidemic. This mass murder is the policy of influential institutions, such as the Club of Rome, which claims that regions such as black Africa are overpopulated, and the world's population must be reduced by such methods. The evil policies of the Club of Rome are being implemented by powerful banking institutions of Switzerland, by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank. These are policies endorsed by high officials of our own Federal Reserve System. These are policies being put into effect in many parts of the world by Henry A. Kissinger and his friends. This monstrous immorality, practiced abroad, comes home to us today in such forms as a growing movement for genocide against our own nation's most vulnerable citizens, the seriously ill and our senior citizens. The same crime for which we condemned Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg trials, the crime of new euthanasia, is being promoted in the United States and in Western Europe today as death with dignity. This growing murder of our seriously ill and senior citizens is being promoted by persons and groups who argue that such systematic murder of tens of thousands and more of our citizens is needed to keep down the average cost of health insurance premiums or to help balance the Social Security budgets. So it must appear that a judgment like that, fallen upon biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, looms above the flesh pots of our morally sick nation. We can escape this threat and doom if we as a people awaken in time. We must recognize where we made the wrong turn in morality and in government policy making during the post-war period. We must reverse that error and do it quickly. Time is running out. I also proposed that this new strategic doctrine, which the President announced on March 23rd, 1983, would be a way of destroying the rotten agreement which Bertrand Russell and others made with Moscow back during the 1950s. The rotten agreement which Henry Kissinger and others have been defending in their function as Soviet agents of influence. I did this for many reasons, but above all, I did it to eradicate Russell's and Kissinger's policies of Malthusian genocide by destroying the roots of Kissinger's feudalistic neocolonialism, roots embedded in the nuclear deterrence doctrine. It is now approximately 17 years since April 1967, the day back then when Pope Paul VI issued his appeal for an end to the evil genocide today being practiced by Henry Kissinger's and the fellow travelers of the Club of Rome. Although Pope Paul VI encyclical Populorum Progressio is a Catholic doctrine, it expresses and reflects the very essence of the natural law of Judeo-Christian Western civilization. The essence of natural law is that every human life is sacred, and that the development of the creative mental potentialities of each and all individuals is also the sacred duty of society, and that also society must afford to each and all persons the opportunity to employ the developed potentialities in some way which contributes good to present and future generations. That no man is compelled to go to his grave like a mere beast. This is the law of equity. That law of equity is an absolute, in the sense that no state and no man can deny any individual, anywhere, his right to equity so defined, unless that violation be to defend the very existence of those institutions of society on which the fostering and protection of equity for all persons depends. Unfortunately, neither the Russian Empire nor feudalists such as Henry A. Kissinger and his accomplices accept these doctrines of natural law. In his notorious doctoral dissertation back at Harvard University, Kissinger pledged his future diplomatic career to follow in the example of the Holy Alliance's Prince Metternich. Kissinger pledged himself to the heritage of the Persian, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. He rejects absolutely, in his practice and belief, the Judeo-Christian natural law of Western civilization, and he adheres to that evil misconception of man and the universe typified by the slave society of ancient Sparta and typified by the sodomy-ridden abomination which was the Empire of Rome. In its own fashion, today's rulers of the Russian Empire also trace their philosophical heritage from Lycurgus's Sparta and from the models of empire in which one master race rules as overlord over subjugated races. The injustice we tolerate against the peoples of Black Africa were targeted by the genocidal financial and economic policies of Kissinger and his feudalistic friends is an act of injustice which savagely violates our own most fundamental moral values. The injustice which our government and major political figures tolerate throughout our nation, as they tolerate the FBI's Gestapo-like frame-up against an innocent U.S. senator, and tolerate murder and drug pushing in cities like New York City. These are but an echo of the fact that it is our morality itself which has been shattered by tolerating Henry A. Kissinger and his accomplices in foreign policy. Let us go back to being a great industrial power, an agro-industrial power flourishing in scientific and technological progress. Let us be again what was said of us at the establishment of our independence from the feudalistic policies of Britain, a temple of liberty and a beacon of hope for all mankind. Let us again be the defender of the smaller, weaker nations of the world against colonialism and imperialism in all their manifestations. Let us build among the sovereign nation states a community of principle according to natural law, as Pope Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, beseeches us to do. Let the President of the United States be a person who knows that his or her most essential duty is that of the chief magistrate of a great republic. Let the frightened and oppressed of our own and other nations around the earth look up with just hope from their injured circumstances and say to themselves, this is an injustice which the President of the United States would not tolerate if he knew of it. Let that opinion be justified.
In the 1950s, when Nikita Khrushchev, whom you see here, was in power, the Soviet leaders publicly did sign on to MAD, to mutual assured destruction, as a doctrine, and Soviet officials were present and participated in the meetings where MAD was developed. And I wanted to recommend that people who would like a very concise and excellent review of this question of the hideous two-empire design based on mutual assured destruction and Malthusianism to borrow from someone the tape of LaRouche's March 1984 half-hour broadcast, Kissinger, Soviet Agent of Influence, if you haven't seen it for 9 years or didn't see it at the time. So, Khrushchev himself corresponded with Bertrand Russell, a key architect of MAD, on the unthinkability of war in the nuclear age. But, as Jonathan has mentioned, this did not change the strategy of the Soviet High Command. In fact, since we didn't have defense under MAD but only deterrence, the Soviets found some useful nuances in Russian, and when they were translating about Their own missiles, they use the word zdерживание, which means restraint, and when talking about the U.S. missiles, they would say ustrashение, which means terrorization. In 1962, Marshal Sokolovsky published his book, Military Strategy, and expressed Soviet thinking. I won't give the full quotation, but it included reference to an anti-missile defense system, application of active measures to deflect the missile from its target. He said special attention is devoted to lasers. It is considered in the future any missile and satellite can be destroyed with powerful lasers. But it was only in the late 1960s, after Kennedy was gone, Charles de Gaulle, you see here, was on the way out, only then did Moscow move to enshrine MAD in treaty arrangements with the United States, and their negotiating partner was Mr. Robert Strange McNamara, Secretary of Defense under President Johnson. At the close of 1967, he launched negotiations for a treaty to ban anti-ballistic missile systems, the ABM treaty. Even as late as January 68, after McNamara's first overtures for an ABM treaty, Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin would say at a press conference in London that any superpower capable of developing technical means of destroying nuclear missiles that did not do so, did not develop such strategic defense, was clearly, judging by how often Soviet so-called journalists would pop up at Executive Intelligence Review headquarters to collect pamphlets like this one, the KGB was watching LaRouche very closely. And I can say that the first full-year subscription to EIR ever sold by me was to a Soviet diplomat, although he laundered the payment, and EIR received the check for $396 from a Swiss grain company. Fusion Energy Foundation publications, meanwhile, were writing a lot about Soviet laser work, and therefore Moscow knew that we knew the military applications of their work in this area. In fact, FEF representatives did attend conferences in Russia in the 1970s. But really, anybody who chose to look at the evidence could see that as soon as the ink had dried on the ABM treaty, Soviet anti-ballistic missile programs were simply taken behind closed doors. This diagram leaked out. I don't know if you can see, it has a lovely caption, "Light beam to burn hole in missile." And it got by the censors. It's from a Russian pamphlet published in the Soviet Union in 1974. We rewrote the captions, the originals in Russian, 2 years after the ABM treaty was signed. So the Soviets also knew from their EIR subscriptions, as well as other means, that LaRouche had Reagan's good ear. And as you've been told, half a dozen Soviet representatives, including Mr. Shershnev of the back channel, were present at the February 1982 EIR seminar in Washington. This is the original wide-column article in New Solidarity reporting it, where Lynn proposed the joint development of BMD, ballistic missile defense, by the U.S. and the USSR. I saw them furiously taking notes because I was there. I was the warm-up act, if you can call it that, talking about Siberia. So when Reagan spoke on March 23, 1983, the Soviets knew that it was LaRouche's policy the president had enunciated against all the assurances of their friends in the Democratic Party and Kissinger circles. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Yuri Andropov, by this time, was quick to respond, and he was furious. On March 27, 1983, Pravda printed a front-page interview with Andropov. Question: President Reagan declared he has devised a new defensive conception. What is this in practice? Andropov, quote, "This requires special mention. Laymen may even find it attractive as the president speaks about what seem to be defensive measures, but the strategic offensive forces of the United States were advocating offensive nuclear war." 2 months later, March 1968, Moscow signaled a shift in its public posture. And this was announced by means of a long article in Pravda, which made the classic MAD argument that general war would be unthinkable in the nuclear age. The author of the Pravda article was a former advisor to Khrushchev and to Yuri Andropov at the Communist Party Central Committee before Andropov took over the KGB. His name was Fyodor Burlatsky, there on the left with Andropov from 1961. After Johnson and McNamara left office in '68, the negotiations for the ABM treaty were completed by Kissinger. It was signed by Nixon and Brezhnev. It limited each side, this was 1972, to one anti-ballistic missile system. And it reflected some underlying thinking that the United States maintained defenses for missile fields in North Dakota, while the Soviets installed the Galosh ABM system around the capital, Moscow. In the 1970s, as shown by this 1976 campaign pamphlet, The Danger of General War, LaRouche was warning that the adoption of MAD increased the danger of war. And I want to stress that Moscow was well aware of what LaRouche was saying and publishing already in those years.